I just watched the Michael Cohen's interview with George Stephanopoulos, and I wanted to give you my immediate reaction while it was fresh. There were a number of things that jumped out to me about the interview, which I've noted. In the beginning of the interview, Stephanopoulos is asking him how he feels after obviously a miserable day in court where he was sentenced. And Cohen said, "I have my freedom back." And then later in the interview, he says again, "I have my freedom back. I'm not going to be the villain of his story." Then George Stephanopoulos asks him, "Have you turned a corner?" And he says definitively, "I know I have." And then he says, "I know the truth. I took responsibility for my actions." Then Stephanopoulos asks him, why did you do it? Why did you lie for the president? And he says, he did it out of loyalty. And then later he says, "I gave my loyalty to someone who is not deserving of loyalty." And Stephanopoulos presses him, and he says, you lied for a long time. And Cohen says, "Yeah, for 10 years." And then Stephanopoulos again tries to get to why did Cohen do it? And Cohen repeats that it was loyalty, but he denies that it was driven by greed. And Stephanopoulos says, "Well, why should we believe you now?" And he just said, "I'm done with the lying." And then he talks about how Stephanopoulos asked him, "I used to see you back when you were working for Trump. Looked like you were having a lot of fun at the time. What changed? What happened?" And Cohen said, he seems to say, "I don't really know when it changed, but it went from being fun to something that obviously was a burden." Now, Stephanopoulos concludes the interview by asking him how this ends, both with Trump and for the country, but also for him personally. Now, Cohen couldn't answer, because he's still cooperating with the investigation, how the investigation might end, but he does offer an honest answer to what happens for him, where he basically says that he doesn't deny that he's concerned. He says it's never good to be on the wrong side of the president, but he says that whatever he does going forward, he wants to be known in history for trying to work to bring the country back together. Now, I remember I found this interview to be interesting, but also powerful, and it made me think about my time working on the Trump campaign. It's now been a while, and it's something I don't think about too much, but a lot of it just really resonated at a personal level in a powerful way. I remember that I guess I began this whole business when I signed on to be part of the Huckabee campaign, largely on the expectation that the campaign would resemble to some degree what I saw of Governor Huckabee in 2008. When I had joined, I joined very early on. I want to say I gave an informal commitment in late 2014, well before actually any of us really knew that Trump would be entering the race. And then when Trump did enter the race, obviously he overturned the dynamics of the race, and he really just brought out a side of the Republican electorate that many of us had not seen. And I began really from that point forward, it became abundantly clear to me that although I was obviously campaigning against him in a way, that I, just having been on the campaign and also starting to get involved with prediction markets and so forth, I knew that this Trump phenomenon is real. And it's easy to forget that it took a long time for people to come to terms with the fact that Donald Trump was about to walk away with the Republican nomination. But being on the campaign, watching how this would unfold, it was abundantly clear to us that there was something real about this. Now, I remember that I was not a never Trumper. Trump certainly was not my top choice. I would say he wasn't even in the top half of the candidates in the race, other than Huckabee. But I wasn't a never Trumper. That although I thought he was of questionable character, I was also excited about the possibility of someone coming from outside of politics, who seemed to have a track record of, at a minimum, building a personal brand. And I thought that our political system could benefit from someone shaking things up. Now, when I got so I left the Huckabee campaign and moved back to Washington, and I felt at that time like I had basically gotten my fill of the campaign. Being a policy person on a presidential campaign was something that I had wanted to do for a long time. But after going through that experience, I just felt fulfilled, and I wasn't itching to get back into the game. But I ended up receiving a phone call that I wasn't expecting from a colleague of mine who himself had been named to a seemingly senior position on the Trump campaign, and he asked me if I would agree to join him and join the campaign and work with him. And I think had I been a strong never Trumper by this point, I just would have said no, and that would have been the end of it. But I was on the fence about Trump. I thought and continue to think the world of the colleague who invited me to join. And I also thought that it might be an interesting opportunity to pursue. And so I joined the campaign, or I at least offered, to give it a chance. And I remember I showed up to this office, which I guess had been the old Ben Carson campaign office in Washington, or not in Washington, in Virginia. And I realized that Trump was on the brink of winning the Republican nomination, but he really had no policy apparatus whatsoever. I mean, basically, they were just in the early stages of trying to pluck people from different campaigns or wherever they could find them, who were willing to work for the campaign. So I was there right at ground zero, and then finally we got some office space in the Old Town area in Virginia, and I remember we were sitting in this office, and this was actually right around the time when the Indiana primaries were unfolding, and if you remember, Trump and Ted Cruz were in a heated race, and a lot of people thought that while Trump had the edge, that the Trump-Cruz fight would continue for a long time. So I'm sitting here in this office, and then before I know it, I've been assigned that I'm the policy coordinator of the campaign. They took my bio and information. They were getting ready to issue a press release, basically showing that serious people with various credentials were signing on to the campaign. Now, now to all of our surprise, Cruz dropped out of the race after losing Indiana, and then somewhat, and then the campaign decided not to release any of our names or anything like that. And so I was, I was basically now the policy coordinator, but it wasn't really like a full-time thing. There were people who were in the office full time, but I wasn't at this point collecting a salary. So I was going in and helping where I needed to and writing policy papers and so forth. And during this time, I never throughout my experience met Trump himself. I was actually not even in a meeting with him, and I'll get into why that was. But I did talk to Stephen Miller, and there were other people involved who I got to know. Now, as I began to, as this campaign went along, first in the primary and then in the general election, I could very much relate to what Cohen was saying about this transition from it being fun to not fun, and there was a part of it, the work was fun, being on the policy side, and it was kind of cool to be on the inside of a campaign that remained very much opaque, and I began to connect with a lot of people interesting people who cared about the party and cared about the country and whatnot. But I just remember like every day I was involved with this. It wasn't fun. It began to just take more and more of a toll. And then at a certain point, I just began to like hate the idea of checking my phone to see who was calling or emailing. I hated the idea of showing up to this office. I began to just realize that this goal I had my whole life of working on a campaign, getting in early, and then going into government, I just was like losing all ambition to want to do that. But I just kind of like persisted. And when I look back, I don't really even know why I did it. I was just sort of caught up in this thing. And I remember I went out to Cleveland for the convention, and I was working on the policy platforms, and it was all very interesting. But again, I mean, it just felt like a chore. And so I remember I went there for the week before when the policy subcommittees were meeting, and all the preparations were happening. But most of the crowd and so forth weren't there yet. Anyway, so I did all this preparation. Then I actually flew back to Washington before Trump gave his speech. And I remember I was back in Washington watching the speech, and I'm watching Trump on TV, and it was just really embarrassing. Like we had done all this work. There were serious people doing work, and then you watch the guy talking about how only I can fix these problems, or whatever that infamous quote was. And I remember like I texted a friend of mine who I trusted, and obviously, and I was like, what the hell is this? The guy sounds like a Latin American despot, and this guy, I'm not going to name him. He said, yeah, I totally agree. And then again, I was watching a couple weeks later, I was watching the Democratic Convention. The first day was Progressive Day at the Democratic Convention. There were obviously all the left-wing excesses you might expect. But by the time Hillary Clinton came and gave her speech, whatever you think of her, I mean, she was there was at least no doubt in my mind that whatever her character deficits were, whatever policy disagreements I had with her, that she was fundamentally a serious person who cared about the institutions of this country and was probably up to the job. So, basically around that time, I had concluded that I was done with this. I mean, this is enough. And so I remember I sent in my resignation to Rick Dearborn, who was the head of the Washington office. And it was a nice email. I just said, look, I can't afford to do this anymore. I don't want to do it. That's fine. And Dearborn sent me a nice email. That was that. And I remember like I biked back to Foggy Bottom, and I was going to Whole Foods to just get some shopping done. And I don't really even know, like, I guess I'm sure there's like a whole psychology literature or on this or whatever, but I remember like I'm not naturally an emotional person, but I just had this like all of a sudden out of nowhere, I just started crying, and and it wasn't like sadness or happiness. I don't know what it was. It was just some kind of an emotional release. And what I think was probably going on is that I think like often our sort of subconscious or just something, our body or whatever just knows like what we're feeling and what we're doing even before our logical minds sometimes do. And I remember just thinking that this was really the end of a certain chapter, that I had been working really since high school for this opportunity to be part of a presidential campaign and to be involved with politics and so forth. And I knew that was over. That chapter was closed, and I didn't really know what would come next. And I remember I just watched the campaign more from a distance at that point. And I didn't at the time really litigate my differences with the campaign. I didn't feel a need to, and I was doing other things. But I remember that a couple weeks later, the infamous Billy Bush tape was released, and at that time I was a magazine editor at the National Interest, which by this point had taken an editorial line very much in favor of Trump. But when that Billy Bush thing happened, I knew like logically that of all the transgressions, all the character flaws, all the things Trump had done, I knew he had done, that this Billy Bush tape at the end of the day was like scratching the surface. I mean, there were any number of things that were far worse, but I just, something, I just knew that enough was enough. And I spoke out definitively against the campaign. I issued a press release, and that was that. And I knew that there would be consequences of it, but it was enough. I mean, I didn't care at that point. And I think that a lot of what Michael Cohen was saying in his interview, a lot of the questions he was asking, it just, it really rang true. Like when he said, I know the truth. I don't know what I did it, but I'm done with it. I'm done lying. I'm ready to take responsibility. It was really powerful to me when he said, I have my freedom back. And that was very much how I felt at the end of this process, that I knew that there would be a price to pay for this. And, part of it was hurtful. I mean, I remember after I spoke out against the campaign, there were obviously people who were congratulating me and whatever, but and then obviously there were a lot of people who just ignored it. But I think the hardest ones to deal with were the people who I respected on the campaign or in Republican politics, who there were kind of two reactions I got. One was basically, maybe there are three of them. One was that this accusation that it was an opportunistic thing to do. And I found that to be surprising more than anything, because anyone who knows anything about politics knows that disloyalty or breaking from your tribe, it doesn't matter what the merits are. I mean, you're all these people on the other side, they might cheer you for a day, but at the end of the day, it's your relationships on your own side that really matter. So I wasn't too concerned about that, but there were other people who basically made the argument that, one, this was a self-defeating thing to do, and the other, obviously, I got these like random emails and things that, this was very inappropriate, it was disloyal, you were betraying an opportunity that people gave you. And I knew at some level that they were, that there would be consequences, but it just didn't matter, that things had gotten to the point where there was just something about walking away from that experience that was liberating and felt free, very much like how I think Michael Cohen felt. And how Michael Cohen said here, I don't know what comes next, but he seems to have this resolve to do something about to rectify this part of the campaign and part of this movement that he contributed to. Now he feels a sort of sense of obligation to try to rectify it. And I felt some of that also. I guess what I wanted to say about this Cohen interview, I want to maybe speak to three issues here. The first is that I want to talk directly to people, many of whom are my friends who are either involved in the administration, working for Trump, or even if they're not directly working for him, they're in some kind of a job, some kind of a profession, some kind of a something where they find that they feel an obligation, whether formal or informal, to try to apologize for the president or be a part of this. And what I can tell you is that if you're doing this out of obligation or out of fear because you don't know what could happen if you speak your mind or you break out, I guess what I can tell you is that, first of all, odds are that while there might be repercussions, that there's an abundance of opportunities out there. You're going to meet new people. You're going to have new opportunities, and the emotional and mental freedom that you'll get from being honest, being out there, speaking your mind is something that's hard to understand when you're in the grind, when you're in the moment, but it is a form of release that you can see in the Michael Cohen interview. You can see from a lot of people who have gone through a similar experience that it's going to be liberating. And I would urge you to ask too, don't think about what the incentives are right now, but think about how you'll feel at the end of the process when it's all over. And I'll talk later how I think this is going to end. The second thing that I want to second group of people I want to talk to, and this is probably the majority of my acquaintances on the right at this point, who know that Trump is a questionable guy, who know that there are serious competence and ethical issues in this administration, but feel for whatever reason that it's the pragmatic thing to be doing, to stand by Trump, maybe for ideological reasons, maybe because of certain policy reasons, maybe because of the other side is worse or whatever. And I guess what I can say to that point is that whatever agenda, whatever policy thing that you want to get forward, you can see in the Michael Cohen interview, and you can see just with any kind of a even a simple research into Trump's background, his record. There is not a thing Trump has done. There is not a thing Trump has been involved with that has not been built on a lie, that has not been built on ethical lapses, that probably to some degree involves questionable legal practices, and ultimately that have not that have involved people who have been very loyal to Trump, that have not been repaid for their loyalty, or if anything have been punished for it, and ultimately that have not produced the results that they were intended to. And I would urge you to think about what are the end goals that you want out of this Trump thing, and then really think about whether Trump himself is facilitating those ends, or whether or not he's an obstacle or a barrier to getting there. And my venture is that in the long term, Trump is actually going to produce a blowback to many of the things that he and his supporters want to achieve, rather than being an enabler or facilitator of them. Now, the final thing is I want to try to answer the question that George Stephanopolous posed to Michael Cohen, that Cohen was not at liberty to answer, which is how does this end? Not for Cohen, but for the country and for Trump. And there's something that I think about a lot, just by virtue of having thousands of dollars of my own money invested in the political prediction markets. And I think what you're going to find is, what I found at least, is that the vast majority of people I know who are involved with the Trump campaign, with the Trump administration, and with Republican politics, even though I may differ with them on some of their politics, that they reflect really the character of this country, which I think is ultimately forgiving, and which has an ability to correct itself and change course when it needs to. And I think we're right at the cusp. I don't know whether it'll be a matter of weeks or months or maybe even a year or two, but there is going to be a collective recognition that the country generally, but the Republican Party specifically, made a very serious and grievous mistake in electing Trump. And whatever rationale there was at the time, those reasons, those hopes that animated Trump's election have been dispelled and disproven. And we're going to see the dam break at some point as we get the Mueller report, as we see the inability of the administration to bring the country together, to get policy outcomes through, when we see the inability of the president and his senior advisors develop an administration and a workflow that is effective, and ultimately when we see that the president is psychologically and emotionally incapable of acting with integrity and acting with maturity, the dam is going to break at some point. There will be an exodus of people who decide that they can no longer deal with it. The guilty conscience that I think a lot of people are already dealing with will overcome them, and I think that this is a situation that's not going to end well for the Trump presidency. The country will have to go through some kind of a transition, which may or may not end well, and there will be a course correction. And whatever your involvement is with this Trump phenomenon, whether you're intimately involved or whether you're simply a passive observer, I'll offer my prediction here that I think that those who stuck with Trump till the end, those who never expressed remorse, those who never broke and went with their conscience, are not going to look well at the end of this process, and are going to be left more than anything saddled with a lot of regrets and a lot of questions and a lot of consequences, as you're seeing with Michael Cohen.